Part 1. At the birth of a silent predator, long before its silhouette carved circles across the burning skies of the Pacific, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was born from a quiet but urgent fear. In the late 1930s, Japan understood something most nations did not yet fully grasp: air superiority would define the wars of the future. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a fighter aircraft unlike any that had come before it. It had to fly farther than any competitor, maneuver with impossible agility, and dominate the skies from the decks of aircraft carriers scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean. The challenge fell upon a quiet engineer named Jiro Horikoshi at Mitsubishi. The demands placed upon him bordered on absurd. A carrier fighter with extreme range, lightning agility, heavy armament, all without sacrificing speed. To achieve this impossible combination, Horikoshi made radical decisions. Every gram mattered. Armor protection was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were abandoned. Structural weight was stripped to the bone using an advanced aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin. The result was a machine that seemed to float through the air rather than fight against it. When the prototype finally lifted from the runway in 1939, something extraordinary happened. Test pilots described the sensation as if the aircraft were an extension of their own bodies. The controls responded with uncanny smoothness. Tight turns that would stall other fighters became effortless arcs through the sky. The aircraft was designated the Mitsubishi A6M. Allied forces would later give it the simpler name, Zero. At the time, few outside Japan understood what had been created. In a world still dominated by biplanes and conservative designs, the Zero represented a leap forward. It could fly over 3,000 kilometers with external fuel tanks, a staggering range for a fighter aircraft. It carried two powerful 20mm cannons in its wings and two machine guns in the nose. But its true weapon was agility. The Zero could outturn almost any aircraft in existence during the early years of the war. Pilots quickly learned that the aircraft rewarded finesse. It punished brute force but rewarded fluid movement. In tight aerial combat, the Zero seemed to dance. Enemy aircraft found themselves trapped inside its turning circle, helpless as the Japanese fighter slid effortlessly into firing position. To the men who would soon face it in battle, the Zero would appear almost supernatural. But this ghost of the Pacific had already been forged in the quiet discipline of engineering, the relentless pursuit of aerodynamic perfection, and the willingness to trade protection for dominance. The world was about to learn its name in fire. Part 2: A Fire over the Pacific. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M0 emerged like a predator finally unleashed. From the decks of Japanese carriers cutting through the morning waters of the Pacific, waves of Zeros lifted into the sky escorting bombers toward their targets. The most infamous of those moments came on the morning of December 7, as Japanese aircraft approached Pearl Harbor under pale Hawaiian sunrise. American radar operators had detected unusual signals hours earlier, but confusion and disbelief delayed any meaningful response. Then the sky exploded. Zeros screamed across the harbor, diving low over battleships and airfields. Their engines roared with a distinct mechanical fury, the sound echoing across the water as anti-aircraft fire erupted from below. American pilots rushed toward their aircraft, many of which were still parked wingtip to wingtip on the ground to prevent sabotage. In the chaos, the Zero demonstrated exactly what it had been designed to do. It dominated the airspace with terrifying efficiency. American fighters such as the P-40 Warhawk struggled to match its maneuverability. Dogfights often ended within seconds. Pilots who attempted to turn with the Zero quickly learned the fatal mistake of doing so. The Japanese fighter could pivot sharply, rolling into tight spirals that trapped enemies in lethal firing arcs. Stories from survivors described the aircraft as eerily graceful, almost elegant, as if it belonged in the sky more naturally than its opponents. Across the Pacific theater from the Philippines to the skies above Malaya, the same pattern repeated. Japanese carrier groups moved like mobile fortresses, launching coordinated strikes protected by squadrons of Zeros. Allied pilots found themselves facing an enemy fighter that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Even experienced aviators were stunned by its agility. But it was not only the aircraft that made the Zero so formidable. It was the pilots who flew it. Many Japanese naval aviators had undergone years of brutal training. Their flight hours far exceeded those of many Allied pilots early in the war. When skill and machine combined, the result was devastating. The early months of the Pacific War belonged to Japan. In these opening battles, the Zero became a symbol of Japanese air dominance. Allied intelligence struggled to understand the aircraft's capabilities. Reports described impossible turn rates, extreme range, and relentless attack patterns. For a brief but powerful moment in history, the skies of the Pacific seemed to belong entirely to this pale-winged predator. Part 4 Rather Turning Tide. By 1942, the skies of the Pacific were beginning to change. The early dominance of the Mitsubishi A6M0 had forced Allied engineers and pilots to adapt with urgency. Aircraft designers studied every detail of captured Zeros. When a nearly intact example was recovered from Aviation Island in Alaska after a crash landing, American engineers finally had the opportunity to dissect the aircraft completely. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. The Zero's agility came at a terrible cost. It lacked armor. Its fuel tanks were dangerously vulnerable. And at high speeds, its controls became stiff and difficult to maneuver. These discoveries transformed Allied tactics almost overnight. Instead of attempting to outturn the Zero, American pilots began using speed and vertical combat strategies. Fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were designed with powerful engines, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. They were heavier and less agile than the Zero at low speeds, but they possessed one critical advantage: speed. American pilots began diving attacks from higher altitude, striking quickly and then climbing away before the Zero could respond. This tactic, known as boom and zoom, allowed them to avoid the tight turning battles where the Japanese fighter excelled. Slowly, the balance of power began shifting. The Battle of Midway and the long brutal campaign across the Solomon Islands marked the turning point. Japanese pilot losses were becoming impossible to replace. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked a large training pipeline for new aviators. The veteran pilots who had mastered the Zero's graceful combat style were gradually being lost in battle. As newer American fighters filled the skies, the once feared Zero began facing opponents designed specifically to counter it. Hellcats could absorb heavy damage and still return to base. Corsairs could outrun and outgun their Japanese counterpart. Meanwhile, American industrial power flooded the Pacific with aircraft and trained pilots. The Zero was still dangerous. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it remained deadly. But the skies were no longer its domain alone. Part 4 Rather Turning Tide. By 1942, the skies of the Pacific were beginning to change. The early dominance of the Mitsubishi A6M0 had forced Allied engineers and pilots to adapt with urgency. Aircraft designers studied every detail of captured Zeros. When a nearly intact example was recovered from Aviation Island in Alaska after a crash landing, American engineers finally had the opportunity to dissect the aircraft completely. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. The Zero's agility came at a terrible cost. It lacked armor. Its fuel tanks were dangerously vulnerable. And at high speeds, its controls became stiff and difficult to maneuver. These discoveries transformed Allied tactics almost overnight. Instead of attempting to outturn the Zero, American pilots began using speed and vertical combat strategies. Fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were designed with powerful engines, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. They were heavier and less agile than the Zero at low speeds, but they possessed one critical advantage: speed. American pilots began diving attacks from higher altitude, striking quickly and then climbing away before the Zero could respond. This tactic, known as boom and zoom, allowed them to avoid the tight turning battles where the Japanese fighter excelled. Slowly, the balance of power began shifting. The Battle of Midway and the long brutal campaign across the Solomon Islands marked the turning point. Japanese pilot losses were becoming impossible to replace. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the large training pipeline for new aviators. The veteran pilots who had mastered the Zero's graceful combat style were gradually being lost in battle. As newer American fighters filled the skies, the once feared Zero began facing opponents designed specifically to counter it. Hellcats could absorb heavy damage and still return to base. Corsairs could outrun and outgun their Japanese counterpart. Meanwhile, American industrial power flooded the Pacific with aircraft and trained pilots. The Zero was still dangerous. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it remained deadly. But the skies were no longer its domain alone. Part 5: The Last Guardians of the Empire. By 1944, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was no longer the dominant fighter it had once been. Yet it remained everywhere. Japanese industry continued producing variants of the aircraft, including the A6M5, which featured stronger wings and improved speed. Engineers attempted to adapt the aging design to the new realities of aerial combat. But time was running out. Allied aircraft technology had advanced rapidly. Radar, improved engines, and superior pilot training programs were transforming the battlefield. Still, the Zero endured. Across the Pacific Islands from the Philippines to Okinawa, Japanese pilots continued climbing into the cockpits of these aircraft, knowing the odds were increasingly against them. Many of those men were no longer the elite aviators of the early war years. Training programs had been shortened. Fuel shortages limited practice flights. Experience was becoming rare. Yet the Zero still held symbolic power. Its pale wings carried the red rising sun, a national emblem that represented both pride and sacrifice. For many pilots, flying the Zero meant defending not only territory but the honor of their homeland. In the final phase of the war, some Zeros would be used in the most desperate missions imaginable, kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions transformed the aircraft into guided weapons, loaded with explosives and flown directly into Allied ships. It was a tragic and haunting evolution of an aircraft once celebrated for its elegance and agility. The skies that had once showcased its graceful combat maneuvers were now filled with smoke, desperation, and the fading hopes of an empire at war. Part 6: Echoes in the Sky. War eventually ends, but machines that shaped history leave echoes behind. Today, the Mitsubishi A6M0 exists mostly in museums and restoration hangars, silent witnesses to one of the most intense aerial conflicts in human history. The aircraft that once ruled the Pacific skies now sits beneath quiet museum lighting, its wings no longer slicing through clouds but suspended in still air. Visitors often pause in front of it longer than expected. The Zero is more than a machine. It is a paradox. It represents both brilliance and tragedy. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering, a fighter designed with almost obsessive precision. Yet the same design philosophy that made it so agile also made it fragile. Its story reflects the rise and fall of a wartime strategy built on speed, surprise, and sacrifice. For historians and aviation enthusiasts, the Zero remains one of the most fascinating fighters ever built. Its influence shaped the development of later aircraft. The lessons learned from fighting it forced Allied engineers to rethink air combat entirely. Every dogfight, every maneuver, every pilot who faced it in the sky contributed to the evolution of aerial warfare. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of the Zero lies in the human stories connected to it. The young pilots who trusted their lives to its wings. The engineers who built it under impossible demands. The adversaries who faced it in desperate battles over open ocean. When you stand beneath the preserved Zero today, you can almost imagine the sound of its engine starting, the propeller cutting through morning air, the aircraft lifting slowly from the runway and climbing toward the endless horizon. History does not disappear. It waits quietly in places like this. Part 7: The legend that refused to fade. Legends are not defined only by victory. Sometimes they are remembered because they change the world. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered the Pacific War as an unstoppable predator. For a brief moment in history, it dominated the skies with unmatched agility and range. It forced an entire generation of Allied pilots to rethink how air combat worked. It shaped the design of new fighters and accelerated the evolution of aerial warfare. But the Zero also carried the weight of a nation's ambition and desperation. It flew in the earliest triumphs of the Pacific War and in its darkest final moments. From the blazing skies above Pearl Harbor to the desperate battles of Okinawa, its wings were present through the entire arc of the conflict. Even today, aviation historians continue studying its design. Engineers still admire the elegance of its lightweight structure and aerodynamic efficiency. Pilots who have flown restored examples often describe the same sensation reported by the test pilots in 1939, the aircraft feels alive in the air. Yet what truly makes the Zero unforgettable is not just its performance. It is the human story embedded within its aluminum skin. The hopes of engineers. The courage of pilots. The fear of those who faced it. The lessons learned in the skies of war. In the end, the Zero reminds us that technology is never just machinery. It reflects the ambitions, fears, and sacrifices of the people who create it. And somewhere in the imagination of history, the sound of its engine still echoes above the endless blue of the Pacific.